Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our conference on Decolonising Psychotherapy and Empires of the Mind. My name is Del Loewenthal, and I'm chair of both the Critical Psychotherapy Network and the Southern Association for Psychotherapy and Counselling, who are bringing this conference to you. It started off as being a call for papers by the European Journal of Psychotherapy and Counselling, and the papers will appear early next year in the journal, and we hope and expect later in the year in a book. So thank you very much for coming. We're in such an extraordinary times. I don't know about you, but I could never work out how the Third Reich got going. Yeah. And now it's all too easy for me to see how that sort of third empire happened, because there seems to be competing fourth and fifth empires happening at the moment, at least in the world, with the horrors of, from my point of view, the kind of retribution that's happening in the States, and extraordinary meetings of all the military on next coming Tuesday, where they'll have to probably swear allegiance to the president, and have to be a further culling of all sorts of things. And we've got, in the East, we've got empires trying to expand like crazy, desperately. And we have situations like Gaza, horrendous. So thank you for coming when we've got such populism that plays on racism. I'm welcoming you from two, as I say, two organizations. One is the Southern Association for Psychotherapy and Counselling, which sort of travelled from Wimbledon, where it now is, down the A3 to the University of Surrey, where we established one of the first doctoral programs, a master's and undergraduate course, then moved to Roehampton. Now we're back in Wimbledon, particularly interested in practice and looking at practice through phenomenology and the implications of existentialism, humanism, psychoanalysis, and critical psychotherapy. And we've run a variety of programs which people can get UKCP registration with, a supervision course, which we're running now. And next year we hope to introduce looking at the therapeutic use of photographs as a separate route in. We're also bringing you this program from the Critical Psychotherapy Network, which came out of a book on critical psychotherapy, psychoanalysis and counselling I got together quite a few years ago, led to a conference at the Freud Museum. At the Freud Museum, people wanted to have a meeting, and we've been meeting ever since. We meet, actually, I'm sorry about the misspelling of Hampstead. There must be some reaction or something to Hampstead, I think, there. We actually meet at the Philadelphia Association, and our next meeting is on Saturday, the 15th of November. I say that because if anyone would like to come along, we've got space for about a handful of people. Do contact me beforehand. So I'd like to take the second part of our title, Empires of the Mind. And I was looking at books that have come out with that title. Well, on the left is a sort of book that came out in 91, the 90s book, Lessons to Lead and Succeed in a Knowledge-Based World. Vital, they say, for this is vital book. Well, hopefully none of you have come to know more about that or get better at it. But hopefully more interest in a book that came out in 21, Empires of the Mind. And of course, that's a picture of the Empire Windrush arriving from Jamaica. And it's written by historian Robert Gildear. And he's sort of saying, you know, that empire is still with us in the mind, if not in reality. And there's nostalgia for empire. He goes on how that's bedeviled our relationship with Europe, with Brexit. We have still fantasy of empire conjured up with interventions in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq. And we still have these kind of colonial hierarchies in metropolitan societies, which have excluded and even radicalized immigrant populations. And he asks for a rethink of our relationship with former parts of the empire, with minorities who have arrived here from former colonies. And somebody else who's used this title with empires of mind, the only person I could find with regard to psychotherapy is Lennox Thomas. And Lennox Thomas, looking at colonial history and its implications for counselling and psychotherapy, says, living in a post-colonial culture, many people have a connection with empire. This might be as descendants of former subjects from far-off lands, the pink portions of the old world map, or as the offspring of those who went out to those countries to run them. Those days are collectively looked back on as a golden age by traditional British society, when the UK led the world in industry and commerce. He says he's interested in how the pride in a time gone by affects us as therapists and people who use therapy. And I think one of the key things of this conference is that it's really, we need to look at how it's affecting us as therapists before we can really dare look at how the people, our clients and patients. And it's difficult, I think, for us to do this because of the language we're born in. You know, my father used to say, you know, I opened my mouth and in it I put my foot. And I hope that we can help each other. We particularly have, as part of our day, group meetings where we can discuss and explore our ideas and where they're coming from with regard to this really difficult area. And so I hope we can do it. I've also asked earlier if people could keep their microphones off while somebody's speaking, but do switch them on when you want to say something. Well, some initial tentative questions for this conference. You know, this first one, I think we could just spend the whole conference on without going any further. Can we consider what it means for all people to be regarded as equal? There's a question, to what extent can we do that? You know, given some people would argue we're always living off the surplus value of other people and other countries. But how far can we at least go in that direction of regarding people really as equal? So can we be attentive to how our clients' patients' culture, practices and experiences may differ from our own as the psychotherapists? Now, do we take us as the yardstick or the meter rule? Can we be attentive to the assumptions that we as psychotherapists may hold about notions such as culture, superiority and civilization? Is it possible to think about these sort of complex experiences, assumptions and notions, even if they may and probably will unsettle and disorientate us? Is it essential to at least consider that being trained as a psychotherapist often leads us to overvalue the theories we've been taught, taking them as objective and scientific, never mind evidence-based, without thinking them as products of Western Europe in times of colonialism, empires and population shifts? I'm so delighted today we have people from such a variety of modalities and trainings. It's so rare still to find this. Won't we first as psychotherapists then have to reflect on our own colonial mindsets, which we can wrongly normalise? Another question, how can we and our clients do this whilst exploring the complexities of pride in our different heritage? So how then, if we can, do we work in a post-colonial way with our clients? I'm using clients and patients interchangeably. Well, the key figure, if not the most important figure here, is Frantz Fanon. Now, Frantz Fanon never gave a single dictionary definition, as I understand it, of post-colonialism. And what I'm about to say, I think people have perhaps very different ideas on as we go through the conference, so please do challenge what I or anyone else is saying. So I think the term was more developed later by theorists building on his work. You know, his writings, particularly The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks, laid the sort of foundation. But we might think of the way Fanon may have framed this notion of post-colonialism. So first of all, colonialism leaves deep scars. So even after political independence, colonial structures of power, economics and psychology continue to shape the lives of the formerly colonized. So liberation isn't just throwing off the colonizer, but rebuilding identity, culture and self-worth. Secondly, there's this thing of national independence can reproduce colonial patterns. So now Fanon warned that post-independence elites often imitate colonial rulers, preserving inequality and exploitation. For him, post-colonial meant the danger of neocolonialism, foreign powers still controlling through economics and local elites. Thirdly, there's this very important for us, psychological decolonization. For him, this was central. In Black Skin's White Mask, Fanon showed how colonialism imposes an inferiority complex where colonized people internalize racist values. And true liberation then means breaking these mental chains, not just changing government policy, changing governments. Well, fourthly, and perhaps more controversially, he advocated violence as a process of renewal. So in, for example, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon argued that anti-colonial violence could be a necessary step to reclaim dignity and agency. He also was seen to be saying that post-colonialism for him wasn't a quiet aftermath, but an active process for creating a new humanism beyond colonial categories. Yep. So for Fanon, what we now call post-colonialism is not just a time after colonialism. It's a struggle against the lingering psychological, cultural, and economic domination of colonialism, and a demand to create new, self-defined identities and societies free of both colonizer and imitation. Well, I'd like to briefly look at you with Fanon compared with some post-colonial thinkers. So if we look at Fanon and then look at Edward Said, Edward Said had this sort of focus on culture, representation, and Orientalism. And his ideas included colonialism being sustained not only by armies and economics, but by knowledge and representation. And he particularly focused on this idea of Orientalism. This is the West's distorted portrayal of the East as exotic, backward, or dangerous, whatever, justified domination. And post-colonialism means challenging these cultural stereotypes then and reclaiming the power to define one's own identity. So this is different from Fanon, so there's less emphasis on violent psychology and more on discourse and power in language and culture. Another later post-colonial thinker is Hokmi K. Baba, and his focus is on identity, hybridity, and ambivalence, and the key work is location of culture. His ideas included that colonial encounters produce hybrid identities, neither fully colonizer nor colonized, and he emphasized the third space, not the third way. Cultural spaces where new forms of identity emerge, where colonial authority is never complete. It's always undermined by mimicry and ambivalence. So this is again different from Fanon. So whilst Fanon stressed reclaiming authenticity, authentic identity, Baba stresses fluidity in between spaces and cultural mixing. So again, this is different from Fanon. So Fanon stresses reclaiming authentic identity. Baba stresses fluidity in between spaces and cultural mixing. So we can see just briefly some differences here. You know, we've got Fanon talking about revolution, violence, psychology, decolonization. We've got Said talking about representation, cultural stereotypes, discourse, and Baba talking about hybridity, ambivalence, and identity as fluid. Well, just finally, and looking at very briefly at these important people, to look at Fanon's legacy in terms of contemporary post-colonial thought, I'd like to start with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Perhaps the key work here is Can the Subaltern Speak? And her ideas focus on how the voices of the most marginalised, the subaltern, are silenced in both colonial and post-colonial system. She warns that even well-meaning intellectuals, including Western leftists, often speak for the oppressed rather than letting them speak. Builds on Fanon's concerns with voice and identity, but stresses the power imbalances can persist even in anti-colonial struggles. So, like Fanon, she insists on the psychological and cultural effects of colonialism, but she emphasizes representation and voice rather than violence. Another figure important is Achille Mbemba, whose key works on the post-colony and necropolitics have ideas such as analysing how power in Africa after colonialism still relies on colonial logic of domination, and introduces necropolitics, the idea that sovereign power decides who may live and who must die, echoing colonial violence. Also shows how global capitalism and authoritarian regimes perpetuate colonial-style control. So here there's a key link to Fanon, extending Fanon's critique of neo-colonial elites and colonial violence into the 21st century, and so doing highlighting how economic and political domination continues. Again, rather quickly, but if I now look at Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose key work is Decolonising the Mind, and there we find ideas like arguing that language is the carrier of culture. Writing in European languages perpetuates colonial control, and calls for writing, education and cultural revival in Indigenous language. It reminds me, I did a lot of work with cooperatives and community enterprises, but the language of management infiltrated and polluted what was happening. So here, there's a building on Fanon's ideas of psychological decolonisation, stressing that cultural and linguistic independence is as vital as political freedom. Well, finally, I just mentioned Stuart Hall, who explores things like the diaspora, migration and identity in a globalised world. He says identity is not fixed, but formed through history, culture, and power relation, and echoes Fanon's attention to identity formation, but emphasises hybridity that's rather close to Baba, and how post-colonial identity is lived in global multicultural societies. So here, just to summarise, we have Fanon gives us the foundation. Decolonisation of mind, body, and politics. We get Spivak, who says who gets to speak? How do we hear the truly marginalised? And Mbemba, speaking of post-colonial power, still operating through colonial violence, which is now globalised. Ngugi speaks of decolonisation must happen through language and culture and not just politics. And Hall, looking at identity as fluid, diasporic, globalised, not fixed. Well, for our conference today, there are so many other questions. We might be asking, can psychotherapists and clients identify with European cultures without being colonial? What are the challenges when working with clients from non-European backgrounds if our psychotherapeutic theories are Eurocentric? And are all European psychotherapeutic cultures colonial? And are all colonial psychotherapeutic cultures European? So what can we learn as psychotherapists of diverse racial and cultural backgrounds from other academic disciplines that have been exploring issues of post-colonialism? There's always the worry that training of psychotherapists is so narrow and short. Shouldn't these kind of things be absolutely vital for us? So as psychotherapists, how does our pride or our shame regarding our personal and psychotherapeutic histories help and hinder our clients and patients? And what would it mean to decolonize our and our clients' lives? What are there post-colonial methodologies? And to what extent should we, must we, can we decolonize psychotherapy trainings? Well, I think that's one of the first papers we have today on our programme. So as I say, I've got a rather bit of a whirlwind through people that I think are important in what we're looking at, but please, other people presenting, do build on that or disagree with that. So very, very much welcome to the programme. The afternoon session, your chair will be Onell Brooks, and your morning session will be Julia Kane. So very much welcome, everyone. And I'd like to now hand over to Julia to take us forward.